We have Dave in Oregon, who's an atheist. Pronouns are he, him, who has a potential criticism of the modal ontological argument mentioned by Scott Clifton in a call between Matt and Scott. And I do remember that call. You might have to give a little bit background information so that the viewers are filled in, and Dan and everybody else.
I don't know that call, so you'll definitely have to tell me about what that looked like.
Hello, this is Dave. I listened to the call between Matt and Scott Clifton when Khalid called in, and Khalid was doing a modal ontological argument. Scott, at one point, because he was his main point was necessity is not proven; it's not required. Khalid disagreed, and Scott said, "Please look at my video on necessity," which I went and did. And he was wonderful in there. He condensed the Alvin Plantinga modal ontological argument.
Yeah.
And I'll just do the first two premises. It's possible that a maximally great being exists. From one, a maximally great being exists in some possible worlds. Premise two is false. It does not follow. He is using the fallacy of equivocation on possible. Now, the meaning of possible versus possible world is very close, but not exactly the same. And it only shows up when you're talking about something that's eternal. So when you say something's possible, you're saying, oh, there might be a great being, a maximally great being. And then two says, well, then it exists in some possible world, but really possible world says that there is a decision tree or causation link, series of accidents that allows that being to exist or not to exist. And so if I flip a coin and it comes up heads, I could have flipped that with a different level of force and it might have come up tails. Or I may have chosen not to flip a coin at all and it wouldn't come up heads. Or my parents might have decided to make love the night before they conceived me and didn't do it that night, and I never existed at all. There's an infinite number of reasons that I didn't flip that coin and it came up heads.
Yeah, I'm wondering though if you're I'm wondering if you're missing kind of the main point though, which is to say, right? Like, are you familiar with S5?
Yes.
Yeah, so the whole idea is to say that if something is possibly necessary, then it's necessary, right? So are you using with correct. Yeah, so are you biting the bullet on S?
Yes,
I'm sorry?
I am, because what's trying to point out is that once you have infinite as in infinite and eternal, there is no decision tree that allows God not to exist. So if he exists in some possible world and he is eternal, there's no way that he can't exist. The proper premise two from premise one, a maximally great being might exist, is there might be a possible world where a maximal being exists. And then S5 does not help you.
Yeah, so one, I don't run Scott's reverse argument, if that's what you're going with. So I don't really know what benefit or motivational force that has on me or Dan or the viewers. And then secondly, for me, these conversations are easier than that. You don't have to do all this. Like, if you say that there's a necessary statement like God exists, right? Derive the logical contradiction that God doesn't exist. Like, where's the contradiction in God does not exist, right? I don't know what modal ontological argument's going to succeed if you can't derive the logical contradiction, right? So I don't know that you have to do all this work, right? It's just simple. Here's a statement. God doesn't exist. Where's the contradiction, right? And then that does all the work from my perspective that you needed to do for modal arguments.
Well, in this particular case, what I'm trying to say is that premise two is flawed, so the entire argument falls down. Yes, sure. It's got other flaws too, and in fact,
I don't think Scott accepts S5 though. So like to tear down the argument, like, cool, his argument might not work, but like if you asked him, I'm not sure that he would go, yeah, I accept the rules of S5. For viewers that don't know, this is just. I'm sorry.
I'm not criticizing Scott. I'm not criticizing Scott or his method. I'm criticizing the Plantinga premise too.
I thought you said you were doing this towards his reverse argument. Is what I thought you were saying. No.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Okay.
He condemned
I thought that too.
Plantinga's. Okay, I apologize. I was not clear.
Yeah.
Oh, it's fine.
The Plantinga argument to premises 1 through 5 with your conclusion. And
yeah, but look, I'm sorry to cut you off though, but it's like, I don't know why we need to do that. If I just ask the statement, like, right, if someone says God exists and he possibly exists, therefore God does exist by the rules of S5, which for those that don't know, S5 is going to just state if something is possibly necessary, therefore it's necessary. There's a whole load of issues with accepting that. But even if we just grant that, you just run it in reverse. It's possibly the case that God does not exist. Therefore, that God does not exist, right? They're on a par. So now the only question to ask is, what is the logical contradiction that God exists? And what is the logical contradiction that God does not exist? You cannot derive the contradiction in both of those propositions. You just can't do it, especially since the existence itself is not what you call predicate. You don't get to just just define things like that way.
Right.
It's just not how it works. So you don't have to do all that work and analyze the premises. You just have to ask a simple question from my perspective, which is, what's the logical contradiction that God does not exist? Because if it's a logical contradiction, then in every possible world, right, we should be able to have some way of establishing that there's a contradiction in every possible world.
Yes, you're saying that there are other reasons that this argument falls down.
Well, I'm saying there's other reasons because S5 to me is just garbage, but that I'm just granting it just to show that it still is a terrible argument.
Yes, and I'm saying that the argument falls down even before you got to S5.
So we're both in agreement that it's a bad argument. I'm not sure why we're going to keep going with this call, right? Because it seems like we're all on the same page.
Yeah, we are. I'm just my point is you don't have to do all that work, right? I mean,
yeah, I agree with you. I think David Hume figured this out first, right? Which is just like, why I don't know what it means to define something as necessarily existing anyway, right? Like I just it all kind of falls apart for me right from the get-go. And obviously, I'm not saying like positivism or a scientism worldview is going to solve all of your problems either, right? Like maybe there are things that exist without evidential reasoning, whatever. But like, I don't know if God can be one of them. And if it is, there should be other ways we could figure that out besides a priori kind of, reasoning out for these things. So yeah, ontological arguments are always kind of big nothings to me.
Yeah, especially if someone like myself who probably denies a priori as a thing at all. But that's a fringe view that people in philosophy will get mad at me for. So I better be careful.
I basically agree with you. I'm a mathematician. A priori arguments are sophistry. And people who use them are sophists. But I get hit in the face with people who throw these things at me.
Sure.
And it makes it trying to explain why S5 is bad is hard in some cases, where it's pretty easy to say premise 2 is wrong. Premise 2 is dead. So everything else that you're doing that is predicated on premise 2 is worthless. And then the argument stops.
I mean, but I get that. I kind of take an Graham Oppie approach that where like, at any point someone could read a premise and just treat it like a bus stop and go, yeah, I'm getting off here. Right. Like, no, it doesn't stop anybody in premise. This is why like premise arguments to me they're not useless, but I don't think there's a silver bullet theist argument, deductively speaking, that's going to convince the atheist. I don't think there's a deductive argument for atheism that's going to convince the theist, right? You're going to have like preconceived notions kind of built in or things that you have built into it. The best thing to do is to compare the worldview. But in this case, with a priori arguments, like with the modal ontological argument, for me, it just comes down to like, when we talk about necessity, what's the logical contradiction if I say God doesn't exist?
Yeah,
I don't know that anybody's delivered on that. And that to me seems way easier than going through whatever premise they can go, let me write the premise, because you can do that as much as you want.
And in my anecdotal experience, Jmike, and you're probably, obviously this doesn't happen every day where you're talking to Christians about ontological arguments, but like I know a lot of Christians personally who hear these kinds of arguments and aren't convinced by them either. There's a lot of people who are already on the same side as people who are writing these things and who just, the logic still doesn't make sense, so it's not something that can only be grasped by the true believer, I think it kind of falls apart from multiple angles. But
yeah, and to take it to its extreme, to me, I think is the thing that's right. Like, you're wanting to cut it off at premise 2, Dave. I'm trying to go, here's all the toys, play with, Mr. Modal Ontological, person here, like, play with all the toys, right? We'll run through the argument, and I'll give you under S5 the same rule, right? We'll grant that, and I'll just say it's possibly the case that God doesn't exist, therefore God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Right. Now we have the exact same structured a priori argument that shows that God does not exist and shows that God exists. So we just rule it out and go, well, this is clearly like faith. It's a terrible methodology because it's leading to two completely different conclusions, but it's worse than that, because what an a priori argument tries to really do is put all its chips in, right? It tries to put all the chips in. But if you're putting all the chips in and we're getting the two different conclusions, now I can really rule this out and go, yeah, I ain't using modal ontological arguments. This shit sucks.
Yeah. Hot take, but ontological arguments are just fancy precept arguments at the end of the day.
Yeah.
In my opinion. But
yeah.
Hey, it is what it is.
Things
yeah.
I have pointed out, well, you use the same sort of argument to prove that there are omnipotent pink dragons running the universe, or anything else you really want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then,
for sure. Oh, but then they'll say, "Oh, but pink dragons aren't necessarily existing beings or something." There's all kinds of things. Anyway, I think we've milked this conversation for as much as we could get out of it. But thanks so much, Dave, for calling in and talking about it with us, because it does bring up some interesting yet ultimately fruitless pursuits to arguing for the existence of God.
Yeah, and send me an email if you'd like. Send me an email if you like, Dave, because if you want to run through the exact issues you had, I'd be interested in reading them when I have a lot of time to digest it. I'm just stating it wouldn't be the method that I might use. But all right, thank you again, Dave. So I like that where you said it was just kind of this disguised presuppositional argument. So
I think that, like, if you read something like Alvin Plantinga or something, I'm not saying that it's not complete, dribble. It's not completely useless, but it has the same problems as any presuppositional argument would at the end of the day. I feel like when you examine these kinds of a priori points of reasoning and stuff. So I don't know. I'm not convinced by it. That's all.
Yep.